Hello everybody, in this video I'll be showing you how I painted a Nurgles Rotter. As usual, I start off with a base coat of Chaos Black through a Rattle can. You can use any other type of primer that you prefer. Next, through an airbrush I paint the pants and the gloves on the model a Parasite Brown. If you don't own an airbrush, you can do this by brush. On a black base coat you'll probably need a couple of layers. Then, using Reichland Flash Shade, I wash these parts. And as you can see, I'm quite liberal with the wash to make sure I have the desired effect. Next, I make a mixture of four parts Parasite Brown and 1 part Dwarf Skin, and I apply a first base highlights to all these parts, the pants and the gloves. I make sure I do not get into the recesses so that the shading effect stays in place nicely. Next, I make a mixture of 3 parts yellow olive, 2 parts cold gray, and 1 part charred brown, which I didn't show, I'm sorry for that. And I block in all the parts that I want to have the green color on. In this case I took the armor parts on top and the round disc thing underneath. This is then followed by a wash of Aqueous Earthshade. And again, I'm quite liberal with it in this phase. I then make a mixture of 4 parts Parasite Brown and 2 parts Dwarf Skin, and I highlight the pants and the gloves. I make sure I leave some of the previous layers visible to create a transition in the color. I then add 2 parts bone white to this mixture, and I start reinforcing this previous highlight. And as you can see, I try and work towards the light where possible. I then add 2 parts dead white to this mixture, and I repeat the process, making sure I leave little bits of the previous layer visible. Next, I use black and I block in the boot on the model. Then, using anthracite gray, I apply a really rough highlight to the boot. I only stay away from the deepest recesses and leave that black. And this is then followed by a wash of Nuln Oil. Once the Nuln Oil has dried, I go back to anthracite gray and I apply a bit more of a precise highlight, starting to build up the color. Then I make a mixture of 3 parts anthracite gray and 1 part white, and I continue to strengthening these previous highlights. And again, I work towards the light, making sure the color gets stronger towards the edges of the pieces I'm painting. By adding 2 parts white to this mixture, I continue this process. And again, I make sure I leave parts of the previous layer visible so that a transition in the color is appearing. I then make a mixture of 3 parts yellow olive and 3 parts cold gray with 1 part charred brown added to it, and I start building up a highlight on the green parts. I make sure I stay away from the deeper recesses, and I leave a little bit of the color already on there visible. I then add 2 parts dead flesh to this mixture, and I'm gonna repeat the previous process. And again, making sure I leave little bits of the previous layer visible so that the transition will start to take shape. By adding 2 parts bone white to the mixture, I make the color a bit lighter again, and I continue this process of building the color up. Next I add 4 parts ivory to this mixture, and now I'm more focusing on the edges of all the green panels to strengthen the color there, and on places like the holes in the helmet and on the necklace of the model, the neck piece of the armor. I make sure I highlight on the bottom side of those holes. And for the final highlight, I add 4 parts white to the mixture, and I repeat the previous layer, leaving little bits of that layer visible and just strengthening all the highlight areas. Next, using dark flesh tone, I'm going to block in all the skin parts of the model. This color is just there so that the next colors will have will be visible on it more easily. I then make a mixture of 2 parts tan and 1 part dead flesh, and I go over the entire previous layer. And this is going to be the color we'll be working from for the skin. Next, using Reichland Flesh Shade, I wash the skin. This time I make sure the wash isn't pooling, so I'm concentrating on that it's only stacking up in the more deeper parts on the model and not on the upper parts of the skin. I then make a mixture of 3 parts tan and 3 parts dead flesh, and I start building up a highlight on the skin. I stay away from the deepest recesses again, and I build the color up a little bit away from it towards the light. And with that I mean a little bit away from the deepest recesses and then work towards the light. Next I add 1 part pale flesh to this picture, and I reinforce the previous highlight. I then add 2 more parts pale flesh to the mixture, and I repeat the previous layer, making sure I leave a little bit of it visible. On the belly of the model, it's not that necessary that you're super neat and super precise. This has to do with what I'll be doing next. I just make sure there's some light effects going on there, which we'll be showing in the end. I then take Carroburg Crimson, and I used Airbrush thinner, but you can use any other thinner if you don't have Airbrush thinner. And I mix this into roughly a 1-1 mixture, and I start washing around the wounds on the stomach and around the pus boils. If needed, you can add a bit of Carroburg Crimson to it if it's not strong enough. Next I take Druchii Violet, and I repeat the process, but now I stick more towards the gaps in the stomach and the surrounding areas, and I do this while the previous layer is still wet. I then take Khaki and I block in the straps on the model as well as the rope on the back of the model. Then using gunmetal, I block in all the metal parts on the model. And using earth, I block in the block of wood on top of the model. Next, using Anthonian Camo Shade, I wash the straps. And using Agrax Earthshade, I wash the rope, the wood and the metal parts. And as you can see on the wood, I'm quite liberal with the Agrax Earthshade. Next, back to Khaki. I'm going to use the Khaki to highlight both the straps and the rope on the back of the model. I make sure, once again, to stay away from the recesses and just build up the first initial highlight on the straps. As for the rope, it's going to be the final highlight as well, with just this one highlight. The area is so small, it's kind of useless to keep going on that small area. Next I make a mixture of 1 part khaki and 1 part bone white. And with this color I reinforce the highlight I previously made on the straps. And where with the previous layer I went all the way to the bottom of the model, to the bottom side of the parts. With this one I'll roughly go to halfway down. Just building the color up and reinforcing it. I then add 1 part dead white to the mixture, and I repeat this process from the previous layer, leaving little bits of that layer visible and just strengthening the color towards the light, towards the top of the model. In the meantime, the Airbrush earth shade has dried on the wood part, so I take earth again and I highlight the grains on the wooden part. I then make a mixture of 1 part earth and 1 part khaki, and I reinforce this previous highlight. Make sure I stay towards the edges of the wooden block so that the color is actually moving towards the outside of that part on the model. I then add 1 part dead white to the mixture and I reinforce this previous highlight. Next I take silver and a really cheap small brush and I just dab a bit over all the metallic parts with it. And this will give the appearance of it being a bit dented and will still give the highlighted effect. Sorry for the blurry bit, but I use bone white, and with this I paint all the pustules and zits on the model. And for the big boil on front, I then make a mixture of 1 part bone white and 1 part dead white, and I reinforce it a bit towards the upper side of the model of the big boil, and then I add 1 more part dead white to this mixture and I repeat this process. Then using dwarf skin I paint in these wounds on the model. I'll call them wounds for now, but I make sure I leave the nice deep purple shadow visible towards the outer sides of those wounds. I then make a mixture of 1 part dwarf flesh and 1 part elf flesh, and I place a rough highlight on these areas. And using pure elf skin tone I finish these parts off with another consecutive highlight. Then using lavender yellow I go over the zits and boils to give them a more yellowish appearance. And then I went on to paint the base, and I use an airbrush for this, but you can just do it by brush as well. And I use dark earth to paint the entire base basically. Next, using light gray green, I dry brush the base. And this is then followed by a dry brush of beige. And after this layer I painted the rim of the base black, and I dull coated the entire model. Once that's dry I use Nurgles Rotters and I dab that into the pool on the base and also on around the big boil on the belly of the model. Next, using blood for the blood god, I painted in the wounds on the belly. I wanted to have a more fresh wound-like effect on these parts. And once that has dried for like 10 minutes, I go again with the Nurgles Rod and paint in the outer sides on the bottom of those wounds to make it appear like the pus and crap is oozing out of those fresh wounds. And that finishes up this model. In the end, I'm not that sure if I would do the blood effect again. But well, it's on there. Some part in me likes it, and another part in me doesn't like it that much. But I'll leave it for this for now, for sure. So I hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.